just to start then, thanks everyone for the invitation to contribute. This is a paper that I've been drawing from my background as a theatre maker, working with a company in Japan called Gekidan Kaitaisha, who derived their expertise and interest from a group, a dance movement in Japan called Ankoku Buto, which means the dance of darkness, which emerged in the 1950s out of the occupation of Japan, but also, of course, the event, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. And what I want to do is to say that there are different ways of talking about that event that don't just have to be focused, fixated, if you like, on the great dynamics between the great powers and between states and the way that those events are commemorated at the international level. There are different ways that we can understand the history of that through, and what I'm saying in this paper, through bodies, so embodied histories, ways of looking at it that helps us move away from that very dominant narrative that has been so present and so successful over the past 70 years of understanding that event. So in the beginning, it is a bit like that, isn't it? The uranium nucleus was split, releasing lots of energy, broken pieces of atoms, highly radioactive. Depending on the radionuclide, the length of instability and energy they release can be up to 4.6 billion years. Uranium-238, pretty much forever, the length of the Earth. When the atomic bombs are detonated, they create a chain reaction and they amplified inside the bomb to magnify the explosion. 16 kilotons in Hiroshima. That's actually the Trinity test, the milliseconds after the Trinity test, which they filmed with great expertise to capture every single moment of that explosion. So then we have here, that's in a cloud chamber. You can see the dynamic of the atom that's being split, the particle, and you can see that split happening in a diagram, but also in human tissue. So those black kind of spiky shapes are the dynamic that happens when an atomic or a radionuclide is lodged in human tissue. And depending on how long it stays, it can cause all sorts of damage, mutation, disruption, malfunction in the body. And it's not, given that it will cause a permanent harm, but it's also not a given that it won't. If you've done any research into radiation health safety and the evolution of our understanding of that, fundamental problem is that it's been based on external dose. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the scientists went in, they measured, they constructed a dose that was considered to be relatively safe for human occupation in an irradiated zone, and that was far too high. That was 100 millisieverts per year. It was then subsequently reduced over the years, over the decades, to 1 millisievert, which is the international standard, but still it's modeled on that event where it's measuring external dose. It doesn't account for the ingestion of the radioactive material. So this is a fundamental problem in our international standards around radiation exposure that people still to this day have very prolonged debates over and hasn't been resolved. Now here we have the classic image of the flattened landscape. This is the results of a color photo. As you can see, it was heavily documented after the detonation because obviously the value of the information would be very beneficial to US military. They understood what they could send troops into, what troops could be exposed to in a nuclear war. So they were planning at this stage already for conducting a nuclear war. In fact, this is your first version of a nuclear war. And you can see the mundane reality of what it was like to be in the Genbakuchi in the ground zero with the man in the bath. And this is a bit gruesome, but it's a reality that we see this image quite a lot, actually. This is a young boy who then became the chairperson of the Confederation of A&H Bonds in Japan. He's still living and very much alive, Nakanishi Iwao, and very much kicking. He was very supportive of the TPNW, the Treaty for Prohibition. And also I correspond this image with Hijikata Tatsumi, who founded Ankokubuto, this dance form, in the 1950s. And he's working with a famous painter there. And I just want to show that it's not necessarily a direct, you know, I'm going to paint what happened to Nakanishi Iwao as a young boy, but it could be seen as a subconscious reflection of that experiment, of that event, as a kind of reverberation in the subconscious. So I'm saying that an artistic process is a way of reflecting without necessarily consciously directly trying to represent a particular event, particularly at that scale. Okay, so that was in 1965. So you see 2 decades later, artists negotiating the memories still. In fact, there's an idea that, you know, the World War II impacts were so enormous that every single artifact, cultural artifact, for 20 or 30 years afterwards, wherever it may be, could be tied, correlated to the enormity of that impact. Okay, and so here you have a popular rendering of the nuclear phenomenon. This is Godzilla in 1954, the first Godzilla. As you can see, in comparison to today's sort of gigantist kind of blockbuster Godzillas, this is very human scale and quite humble. But it was in fact the only Godzilla film in the Kaiju Eiga, which is the monster series films that Japanese filmmakers in fact innovated and then became worldwide in terms of popularity, taken over by Hollywood. That was the only film where they showed a hibakusha, so someone who is exposed to radiation, and they showed the issue of radioactive contamination. After this film, it gets written out. So when it goes to Hollywood and then it becomes sort of a Cold War dynamic between, you know, clashing titans on the international landscape over Tokyo or whatever city they decide to destroy, that radiation issue is gone. So this is a really interesting, you know, pop culture realization of that issue, which was still present in that time. And again, Hijikata makes a show in 1965 that shows these bodies that are, I mean, I'm making an oblique correlation here with the skin of the scaly hide of Godzilla pinging with radiation. If you know about Godzilla, he comes from the depths of the ocean, he's irradiated, he's highly toxic, or he or she or it is highly toxic and destroys the city in anger because it's been awoken from the depths. So I'm saying this, can you see the scaly skin kind of crusted hide here that, again, we can make a subconscious correlation. And here you also see a sort of Dadaist head wrapping with newspaper. So a media encoded body caked in white mud that is cracking can be taken in 2 ways. On the one hand, you can take it as a sort of encoding of an oppressive system that controls your understanding and overcodes your body with sort of molar normative values, say of you know, the great acceleration in capitalist production in Japan that happened after the war. You can say that, you know, this is the body that reflects that encoding. On the other hand, you can say that the mud is like a protective layer that protects your body from the suffering and the mourning and the pain of remembering what has happened in the past 20 years, which is the wartime experience. And the very difficult memories that wartime experience evokes, including the imperial Japanese imperial expansion. Okay, so as you can see, there's a negotiation directly through the body that these artists are using. They're using the body as an anchor. So here we have in 1960, we have a film. Hosoi Eiko, who works with Hijikata's dancers and him. And they make this film. This is now 5 years after the test on Bikini Atoll that was referred to, the Bravo test, which is the 15 megaton thermonuclear test. And I forgot to mention that Godzilla is also a response to that test, incredibly timely response to that test. And what they're doing, the seamen go out to, out to sea, the fishermen go out to sea, just like the fishermen of the Fukushima, which is the Dragon number 5 fishermen crew that go out to sea to catch their fish near the Bikini Atoll. The thermonuclear test is conducted, they get exposed to radiation in exploded coral. They come back to Japan, to the shores, and they're poisoned with radioactive contamination. So I like to see this body as a sort of a labour body, a muscular fisherman's body, headless, that is used for its labour power. And then you have a cow on the horizon, and the anxious kind of scratching of the sky. And a sacrifice. Again, you can hear the explosions in the sun score and the marked body, like traces, tracks, marks. And then, yeah. And then naked boys lying in a row on the beach with their belly buttons crossed. So it's called Keso to Genbaku, which means belly button and the nuclear explosion, or the atomic explosion. So already there's an awareness of the way that radioactive contamination is communicated, whether it's ingested or whether it's inherited. Finally, you get the nuclear shock that I was trying to avoid showing because we see it all the time as a reflection. So that's only 5 years after, but it marks a certain change in popular consciousness where people understand that radioactive contamination is communicated through the ocean as well. It's not just a land-based destruction of human cities. It's communicated as pollution. And so at the same time, in the popular consciousness, you've got this idea of nuclear power as a genie, creating abundance and radiated cities that are permanently lit and that are explosive out with enormous potential, limitless potential that is propagated for the Disney generation. What Hijikata does in this moment is that he goes back to his childhood village in the north of Japan and starts remembering the figures from his childhood and the memories, even pre-childhood, back in the pre-Meiji period before Tohoku was colonized under the Japanese nation state. And you have a performance that he does in 1972 called Smallpox or Hosotan. And he shows maybe a memory of his grandmother. With shamisen and female voices accompanying. Suddenly he's come back in favour, fashionably, he's got the beard and he's cross-dressing. So, timely again. then if we move to this sign here says nuclear powered society for prosperity. And you see these signs all over rural Japan, and basically it's where they are the targets, the small towns on the coast are the targets of the Japanese government and also the very wealthy utilities. 10 utilities own 10 provinces all over Japan. So they've got sort of electricity fiefdoms. They've broken up Japan to control the electricity. And they target these small towns, you know, with bribes and resources and infrastructure, so that they take on these nuclear power plants and waste dumps. A little bit what Jess was talking about. They take the bribes often because they're impoverished. They have not many jobs, and it's a very short-term, very beneficial. But of course, you've got the long-term waste that you have to manage. In fact, there's a waste dump being proposed in Japan right now. They still don't know what to do with the waste. Where do we put it? You know, we need a long-term repository. So sure enough, a small town in Hokkaido has put up its hand on the sea coast. Why on the sea? Because you need the water to keep pumping out, cooling the plant and pumping it out into the ocean. Okay, so just last slide. Here we have a autoradiograph, which is an old form actually of measuring radiation in the environment, where you put it in a light box and you get the heat or the light emission, and you invert it. So you've got heat in black. And so here you can see it's in biota, it's in avian, reptilian, marine, and also botany in plants. And also you can see it in human products as well after Fukushima. So this is a rendering done by an artist called Kagaya Michimasa. And he's gone all over the world with these as a documentary, as a testimony, as history making, if you like, to show the spread and the dispersal and the distribution of this material that goes out into the environment and can't be controlled. So as a final slide, you have on the right, you have soil that's been taken from a castle in Nihonmatsu Castle that is irradiated, and he's put it in a light box over 3 months, and it imprints on the photographic paper the heat from those little flashing atom particles that I showed you at the beginning. And then on the left, you see Yayoi Kusama's famous pumpkin. She's a pop artist in her 90s, very famous for her pumpkins and polka dots. And I'm making a subconscious reference once again. She started doing pumpkins in 1946, just to show that, you know, this material can be reflected in cultural ways that might not be so conscious, but we can infer and interpret and see how pumpkins even can absorb radioactive material. In fact, there's a little anecdote, which is the Nagasaki bomb, which is like a round shape implosion device, was tested weeks before it was actually used in dummy runs. So they used the same shaped bomb and they called them pumpkins. And so there's a little, another sideways connection that I'm fond of. And you can find more in my book.
All right, thank you very much, Adam.